starving girl collapsed at the church until the pastor read her note. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge when Pastor William Hale heard the sound. It was soft, like a sack of grain dropping onto wood, but there was something human in it, something final. He had been awake since 4, as he always was, sitting in the small room behind the chapel with his Bible open and a cup of coffee gone cold beside him. The mornings were his favorite time. The world was quiet then. The town of Red Bluff slept late, and the desert held its breath before the heat came down like a hammer. But that sound pulled him to his feet. He stepped through the narrow door that led from his quarters into the chapel itself. The light was gray and thin, the kind that made everything look like it was carved from stone. Dust hung in the air, turning slow circles in the silence. He walked between the wooden pews, his boots echoing softly, and pushed open the heavy front door. She was lying on the steps. A girl. Maybe 15, maybe younger. It was hard to tell. Her dress was torn and faded, the color of dirt, and it hung loose on a body that looked like it had been carved down to nothing. Her hair was dark and matted, tangled with bits of brush and dust. One arm was stretched out in front of her, the fingers curled tight around something small. William stepped down and knelt beside her. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, just below the jaw, and felt a faint flutter of a pulse. She was alive, but barely. He had seen hunger before. He had seen children with hollow eyes and women too tired to stand. Red Bluff was not a rich town. The ranchers struggled, the miners came and went, and the drought had been bad for 3 years running. But this girl looked like she had walked through death and kept going anyway. He slid one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees, lifting her with care. She weighed almost nothing. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel the sharp edges of her ribs through the thin fabric of her dress. He carried her inside, past the altar and the wooden cross that hung on the wall, into the small room where he slept. There was a cot in the corner, a wash basin on a table, and a single window that looked out over the desert. He laid her down gently, pulling a rough wool blanket over her. Her hand was still closed tight. William hesitated, then reached down and touched her fingers. They were cold and stiff, locked in place. He worked them open slowly, one at a time, until the small folded paper fell loose onto the blanket. He picked it up and unfolded it. The paper was old and torn at the edges, stained with sweat and dirt. The writing was faint, done in pencil, but the letters were careful. Someone had taken their time. There were only 2 lines. The first was a name, William Hale. His breath stopped. The second line was shorter. She is yours. He stared at the words, his hands beginning to shake. The paper trembled between his fingers, and for a long moment, the world seemed to tilt sideways. He looked down at the girl on the cot. Her face was pale, her lips cracked and dry. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. He had not heard that name in 15 years. The name that came with the note. The name that lived in the part of his memory he had tried to bury. Evangeline. She had been a widow when he met her, living in a town 200 miles south, working in a boarding house and raising a young son alone. William had not been a pastor then. He had been a drifter, a man with a gun and a temper, moving from town to town with no direction and no peace. But Evangeline had looked at him like he was more than that. They had spent 6 months together. He had worked on a ranch outside her town, breaking horses and mending fences, and every Sunday he would ride in and sit with her on the porch of the boarding house. She would make him coffee, and they would talk until the light faded. He had loved her, quietly, desperately, but he had been too broken to stay. One night, after a fight in a saloon that left a man bleeding in the dirt, William had ridden out before dawn. He had told himself it was to protect her, to keep his violence from touching her life. But the truth was darker than that. He had been afraid. Afraid of what it meant to be loved. Afraid of what it would cost. He had not seen her since. Now 15 years later, a girl lay on his cot with a note that said she was his. William sank into the chair beside the bed, the paper still in his hand. His mind raced, trying to piece it together. Evangeline had been a widow. Her husband had died before William ever met her. But if this girl was his, then she had been born after he left. He thought back to those last few weeks, to the way Evangeline had looked at him in the mornings, her hand resting on her stomach in a way that seemed almost protective. He had noticed, but he had not asked. And then he had run. The girl stirred, a soft sound escaping her lips. Her eyes fluttered but did not open. William set the note on the table and stood. He poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and brought it to her lips, tilting her head gently. She drank without waking, her throat working in slow, painful swallows. Outside, the town was beginning to wake. He could hear the distant sound of a wagon rolling down the street, the low voices of men heading toward the mine. The sun was climbing now, spilling gold through the window. But inside the small room, the world felt impossibly still. William looked down at the girl. Her face was so thin, her cheekbones sharp beneath the skin. But there was something in the shape of her jaw, the line of her nose, that made his chest tighten. She looked like Evangeline. And maybe, if he was being honest, she looked a little like him too. He sat back down in the chair and rested his head in his hands. He had spent 15 years trying to become a better man. He had given up the gun, taken up the cloth, built a life around prayer and service. He had believed that if he worked hard enough, if he helped enough people, he could outrun the man he used to be. But the past did not stay buried. It came back, thin and starving, holding a note with his name on it. And now he had to decide what kind of man he really was. William sat in the chair beside the cot for 3 hours, watching her breathe. The sun climbed higher, pouring through the window in a slow wash of gold. The heat began to build, pressing against the walls of the small room. Outside, he could hear the sounds of Red Bluff waking fully now, the clatter of a blacksmith's hammer, the voices of women calling to their children, the creak of wagon wheels rolling past the church. But inside, it was just the two of them, the girl and the ghost of the man he used to be. He had tried to pray. He had closed his eyes and folded his hands and searched for the words, but they would not come. His mind was too full, too loud. The note sat on the table beside him, its edges curling in the dry air. She is yours. 2 words that changed everything. He thought about Evangeline, about the way she used to smile at him when he rode into town on Sunday mornings, dust on his boots and his hat pulled low. She would be waiting on the porch of the boarding house, her hands folded in her apron, her dark hair tied back with a ribbon. She had green eyes, the kind that held light even in the shade. He had loved her quietly, the way a man loves something he knows he cannot keep. They had never talked about the future. Not really. He was a drifter, and she was a widow with a son to raise and a life that did not include men like him. But there had been nights when they sat together in the silence, and he had let himself imagine what it might be like to stay, to wake up beside her every morning, to be the kind of man who deserved that. Then he had killed a man. It had been late September. A rancher's son, drunk and angry, had tried to pick a fight in the saloon. William had tried to walk away, but the boy had followed him into the street, shouting insults and waving a pistol. The shot had come from somewhere behind William, hitting the dirt near his boots. He had turned and drawn without thinking. 1 shot, clean through the chest. The boy had dropped like a stone. No one blamed William. The sheriff had called it self-defense, and the townsfolk had nodded and gone back to their drinks. But Evangeline had been there. She had been walking home from the general store carrying a basket of flour and cornmeal, and she had seen the whole thing. She had looked at him differently after that. Not with fear, exactly, but with a sadness that he could not bear. So he had left. Before dawn, while the town still slept, he had taken his horse and his gun and ridden north, telling himself it was the right thing to do, that she deserved better than a man with blood on his hands. He had not known she was carrying his child. The girl stirred. William leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the chair. Her head turned slightly on the pillow, her lips parting as she took a deeper breath. Her fingers twitched, reaching for something that was not there. Then her eyes opened. They were green. The same shade as Evangeline's. The same fire. For a moment, she just stared at the ceiling, her gaze unfocused. Then slowly, she turned her head and looked at him. William felt his throat tighten. "You're safe," he said softly. His voice sounded rough, unused. "You're in the church. In Red Bluff." The girl did not respond. She just looked at him, her eyes moving over his face like she was searching for something. Her expression was blank, emptied out by hunger and exhaustion. He reached for the cup of water on the table and held it out to her. "You need a drink." She stared at the cup for a long moment, then slowly pushed herself up on one elbow. Her arm shook with the effort. William moved closer, slipping a hand behind her shoulders to support her. She was so light, so fragile, that he was afraid she might break. She drank in small sips, her eyes never leaving his face. When she finished, he set the cup aside and helped her lie back down. She let out a slow breath, her chest rising and falling beneath the blanket. "What's your name?" he asked. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She swallowed, tried again. "Rose." The word was barely a whisper, dry and broken. William nodded. "Rose." It was a good name. Simple. Strong. "I'm William," he said. "William Hale. I'm the pastor here." Her eyes flickered, something shifting behind them. Recognition, maybe. Or just exhaustion. "The note," he said carefully. "The one you were holding. It had my name on it." Rose's gaze dropped to her hands. Her fingers curled into the blanket, gripping it like she was trying to hold on to something solid. "My mother," she said. Her voice was so quiet he had to lean in to hear. "She told me to find you." William's heart clenched. "Your mother." Was her name Evangeline? Rose nodded, her eyes filling with tears. They spilled over, running down her pale cheeks, but she did not make a sound. "Where is she?" William asked, though some part of him already knew the answer. Rose closed her eyes. "Dead." The word hung in the air like smoke. William sat back, his hands trembling. He pressed them flat against his knees, trying to steady himself. "When?" 2 weeks ago. Rose's voice broke. "We were camped outside Prescott. She got sick. Fever. There was no doctor. No medicine." She opened her eyes again, and the green fire in them had turned to ash. "She kept saying your name. Over and over. She made me promise to find you." William felt something crack inside his chest. Evangeline was dead. The woman he had loved. The woman he had left. The woman who had carried his child and raised her alone for 15 years. Gone. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words felt like dust in his mouth. Useless. Empty. Rose looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned her face toward the wall. "She said you were a good man," Rose whispered. "She said you would help me." William stared at the back of her head, at the dark tangled hair spread across the pillow. He thought about the man he had been 15 years ago, the drifter with a gun and a quick temper, the man who had run instead of staying, the man who had left Evangeline to raise their daughter alone in a world that was hard and unforgiving. He thought about the man he had tried to become, the pastor, the man of God, the man who preached forgiveness and redemption every Sunday from behind a wooden pulpit. But sitting here now, looking at this girl who was his daughter, he did not know which man he really was, or if either of them was good enough for what came next. Rose slept through the rest of the day. William sat with her for an hour, then forced himself to leave. He had things to do, a sermon to prepare, a roof that needed patching. The widow Morrison had asked him to come by and pray over her husband's grave, and he had promised he would. But his mind was somewhere else. He moved through the town like a man walking in his sleep. The blacksmith nodded to him as he passed. The shopkeeper's wife waved from the doorway of the general store. A group of cowboys rode by on their way to the saloon, their hats pulled low against the sun, their laughter loud and careless. William nodded back, smiled, said the right things. But inside, he was unraveling. By the time the sun began to set, he found himself standing at the edge of town, looking out over the desert. The sky was streaked with red and orange, the light falling across the land like blood on stone. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the smell of sage. He thought about Evangeline, about the way she used to stand on the porch in the evenings, her arms crossed, watching the horizon like she was waiting for something. He had asked her once what she was looking for. "Nothing," she had said. "Just making sure the world is still there." He had laughed at the time, but now he understood. Sometimes you had to check. You had to look out at the empty spaces and remind yourself that you were still real. Still here. When he returned to the church, the light inside his room was soft and golden. He had left a lamp burning on the table, and it flickered now in the evening breeze that came through the open window. Rose was awake. She was sitting up on the cot, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair was still tangled, her face still pale, but her eyes were clear. She looked up when he came in, and for a moment neither of them spoke. William closed the door behind him and set his hat on the table. He pulled the chair closer to the cot and sat down, his hands resting on his knees. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Rose shrugged. "Better." Her voice was stronger now, less like a whisper. But there was still something fragile about her, something that made him afraid to speak too loudly. "You need to eat," he said. "I'll bring you something." "Not yet." She looked down at her hands. "I want to talk first." William nodded slowly. "All right." The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. Outside, he could hear the town settling into evening. The distant sound of a piano playing in the saloon, the bark of a dog, the creak of wagon wheels on dry earth. Finally, Rose spoke. "She talked about you all the time," she said. "My mother. She told me you were a cowboy once, that you worked on a ranch breaking horses, that you had a scar on your hand from a rope burn." William looked down at his right hand. The scar was still there, a pale line running across his palm. "She said you were good with animals," Rose continued, "that you could calm a wild horse just by talking to it. She said you were gentle." William felt his throat tighten. She was kind to remember it that way. "She said you left because you thought it was the right thing to do." Rose's voice was quiet but steady. "Because you killed a man and didn't want to bring trouble to her door." "That's true." But she was already pregnant. Rose looked up at him, her green eyes hard. "She knew before you left. She just didn't tell you." William closed his eyes. The weight of it settled over him like a stone. "Why didn't she come after me?" he asked. "Why didn't she try to find me?" "She did." Rose's voice cracked. "She looked for you for 2 years. She wrote letters to every sheriff and rancher and preacher she could think of. But you disappeared. You changed your name. You became someone else." William opened his eyes. "I became a pastor." She found that out eventually. 5 years ago, a traveler came through Prescott and mentioned a preacher in Red Bluff who used to be a gunfighter. She knew it was you. "Then why didn't she come?" Rose's expression hardened. "Because by then she was dying. Slowly. Some sickness in her chest that wouldn't go away. And because she didn't want to ruin the life you'd built. She said you had finally found peace, and she didn't have the right to take it from you." The words hit William like a fist. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. "She was wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "She should have come. I would have helped her. I would have, what?" Rose's voice was sharp now, cutting through his grief. "Married her? Raised me? Lived like a family?" William looked up, startled by the anger in her tone. "You left," Rose said. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "You left because you were afraid. And my mother spent 15 years raising me alone, working herself to the bone, coughing blood into rags she hid under the bed so I wouldn't see. She died in a tent in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a Bible and a blanket." William felt his heart breaking, piece by piece. "I'm sorry," he said. The words felt worthless, but they were all he had. Rose stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked away, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "She still loved you," Rose said quietly. Even at the end. She said your name over and over. She said you were a good man. That you would help me if I could find you. I don't know if I'm a good man, William said. But I'll help you. I promise. Rose turned back to him, her expression guarded. Help me how? You can stay here. With me. I'll take care of you. As what? Your charity case? The starving orphan you took in out of pity. As my daughter. The words hung in the air between them, raw and uncertain. Rose's face changed. The hardness softened, replaced by something else. Something that looked like fear. You don't even know me, she said. No, William admitted. But I want to. Rose was silent for a long time. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her gaze dropping to the floor. People will talk, she said finally. They'll ask questions. They'll want to know who I am, where I came from. Let them talk. You're a pastor. You're supposed to be respectable. I was a drifter and a killer before I was a pastor, William said. Respectability is something I borrowed. It was never really mine. Rose looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. Why, she asked. Why would you risk everything for someone you just met? William thought about Evangeline, about the way she had looked at him on that porch all those years ago, like he was worth saving. He thought about the man he had been then, broken and lost, and the man he had tried to become. He thought about all the years he had spent running from his past, trying to build a life out of prayers and good deeds, believing that if he worked hard enough, he could erase the mistakes he had made. But the past did not get erased. It came back. It found you. And when it did, you had to decide who you really were. Because I owe your mother, William said. And because you're here. And because I don't want to run anymore. Rose looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. And for now that was enough. The whispers started on Monday morning. William had taken Rose to the general store to buy her a dress and a pair of shoes. The old one she had arrived in was beyond saving, torn and stained with dust and sweat and the long miles she had walked. She had tried to refuse at first, her pride showing through the exhaustion, but he had insisted. You can't wear a blanket forever, he had said gently. So they went together, walking through the center of town in the morning light. Rose stayed close to him, her shoulders hunched, her eyes on the ground. She was still weak, still thin, but the food he had been giving her, bread and beans and weak coffee, was beginning to bring some color back to her face. People stared. The shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Brennan, watched them from behind the counter as they came through the door. Her eyes moved from William to Rose and back again, curiosity sharp in her expression. Morning, Pastor, she said slowly. Who's this? William felt Rose tense beside him. He put a hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. This is Rose, he said. She'll be staying with me at the church. Mrs. Brennan's eyebrows lifted. Staying with you? Yes. Is she kin? William hesitated. The truth sat heavy on his tongue, but he was not ready to share it. Not yet. Not with the whole town watching. She's family, he said finally. That's all that matters. Mrs. Brennan did not look convinced, but she nodded and went to find a dress that might fit. She returned with 2 plain cotton dresses, one blue and one brown, and a pair of worn but serviceable shoes. Rose tried them on behind a curtain in the corner, and when she came out, she looked almost like a different person. The blue dress hung loose on her frame, but it was clean and whole. The shoes were a little big, but she did not complain. She stood in front of the small mirror on the wall, staring at her reflection like she did not recognize herself. William paid Mrs. Brennan and thanked her. As they left, he could feel the woman's eyes following them out the door. By Tuesday, the whole town knew. The rancher's wife had told the sheriff's wife, who had told the blacksmith, who had told the men at the saloon. The story spread like fire through dry grass, changing shape with each telling. Some said Rose was a niece from back east. Others said she was a runaway. A few whispered that she was an outlaw's daughter, hiding from the law. But the truth was simpler and stranger than any of their guesses. William did not correct them. He let the rumors swirl and settle. He knew that the truth would come out eventually. But for now, he wanted to give Rose time. Time to heal. Time to decide if she wanted to stay. She spent most of her days in the small room behind the chapel, reading his Bible and staring out the window at the desert. She was quiet, almost silent, and William did not push her to talk. He brought her meals and sat with her in the evenings, and slowly, piece by piece, she began to tell him about her life. She told him about the camp outside Prescott, where she and her mother had lived in a tent with 4 other families, all of them poor and desperate. She told him about the work her mother had done, washing clothes for the miners, her hands red and raw from the lye soap. She told him about the cough that had started small and grown worse, until her mother could barely stand. She didn't want me to see her dying, Rose said one evening, her voice flat. But I did anyway. I held her hand while she shook with fever. I wiped the blood from her mouth. And when she finally stopped breathing, I wrapped her in the only blanket we had and buried her myself. William's throat tightened. You shouldn't have had to do that alone. There was no one else. You could have asked for help. Rose looked at him, her green eyes hard. People don't help drifters. They look away. You should know that. He did know. He had been a drifter once, moving from town to town with nothing but a horse and a gun. He had seen the way people turned their backs on those who had nothing, the way they crossed the street to avoid meeting a beggar's eyes. It was easier to ignore suffering than to face it. But he was done looking away. On Sunday, the church was full. The townspeople came like they always did, dressed in their best clothes, their faces scrubbed clean. The ranchers sat near the back, their hats in their laps. The widows sat together in the middle pews, whispering behind their hands. The sheriff sat near the front, his badge catching the light that came through the windows. William stood at the pulpit and looked out at them. He had prepared a sermon the night before, something about grace and forgiveness, but now, standing here with Rose sitting in the front pew, the words felt hollow. He set his notes aside. I'm not going to preach today, he said. A ripple of surprise moved through the congregation. The rancher's wife leaned forward. The sheriff frowned. William stepped down from the pulpit and walked to the front pew. He sat down beside Rose, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. She looked up at him, startled, her eyes wide. Sometimes, William said, his voice carrying through the chapel, the best thing we can do is sit with each other, in silence, and let that be enough. The church was quiet. No one moved. No one spoke. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the wooden walls. Dust swirled across the windows, painting them gold. The light shifted and changed, falling across the wooden cross that hung on the wall behind the altar. William closed his eyes and let the silence settle over him. He thought about Evangeline, about the life he might have had if he had been brave enough to stay. He thought about Rose and all the miles she had walked to find him. He thought about the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. And for the first time in 15 years, he stopped running. When he opened his eyes, Rose was crying. Tears streamed down her face, silent and steady, and she did not try to wipe them away. She just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, letting the grief pour out of her. William reached over and took her hand. Her fingers were cold and small, but they held on tight. Behind them, someone in the congregation began to weep. Then another, and another. The silence filled with the sound of sorrow, raw and honest, and no one tried to hide it. When the service ended, people filed out slowly, their faces soft with something William could not name. A few of them stopped to shake his hand. Others nodded at Rose, their expressions kind. The sheriff paused at the door. He looked at William for a long moment, then tipped his hat. "That was a good sermon, Pastor," he said quietly. "Best one you've ever given." William watched him go, then turned back to Rose. She was still sitting in a pew, staring at the cross on the wall. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "I think so. Do you want to leave? Go somewhere else." Rose was quiet for a moment. Then she shook her head. "No," she said. "I want to stay." William felt something ease inside his chest. something that had been tight and heavy for a very long time. "Then you'll stay," he said. Rose looked up at him, and for the first time since she had arrived, she smiled. It was small and fragile, but it was real. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of red and gold. The wind carried the smell of sage and dust, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its voice sharp and clear. William stood and offered Rose's hand. She took it, and together they walked out of church and into the evening light. The town of Red Bluff would keep whispering. The past would still be there, waiting in the shadows. And the road ahead would be hard, full of questions and doubts and days when the weight of what they carried felt too heavy to bear. But for now, in this moment, they had each other. And that was enough.